But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we dive into the life of Tsar Nicholas II, the last ruler of the Russian Empire. Born into royalty and raised with a very deep sense of duty, he struggled to navigate the rapidly changing tides of the early 20th century. His reign was marked by disastrous events from the Russo-Japanese War to Bloody Sunday, which culminated in Russia's involvement in World War I. His unwavering belief in his divine right to rule, paired with his inability to adapt, led to the collapse of the Romanov dynasty into the rise of the Bolsheviks. Tune in as we explore the downfall of a reluctant emperor and the end of an era. This is the History in Motion podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, as we descend to the eastern side of Europe. After mentioning the Russians many, many times over the last couple of weeks, we thought it a good time to introduce the Russians, and specifically Tsar Nicholas II, onto the stage as we kind of talk through some World War I history. And coincidentally, I think this is one of the more interesting pieces of Russian history when you talk about the end of the Tsar, that whole regime from a monarchy perspective, and going into Lenin and the Bolsheviks, into communism, into the Soviet Union, that has so much impact into 20th century history. So it's really interesting to see how that all got kickstarted, because I think when we talk about world history, all the Red Scare that was happening, all this pushback against communism, it really all starts with the downfall and death of Tsar Nicholas II. And it's a long road to get to there, but Russia really goes through a very aggressive transformation, and unfortunately, a very violent transformation. So we're going to focus on Tsar Nicholas II's life today. There's a lot of other cast of characters around there. We're going to try to push them off to the side a little bit, maybe talk about them, but try to make sure if, when we talk about Lenin and Rasputin, they might need their own episode. So I'm going to focus on Nicholas II, but yeah, very transformational time for Russia in, not the most straightforward way that, you might see in other countries around the world.
I think transformational is such a great word to describe the kind of context we're looking at. When we're talking about Tsar Nicholas, we're talking about the end of the Romanov dynasty, which culminates in him abdicating the throne, closing off the dynasty after 3 centuries of rule. So it's something that endured quite a long time. But to your point, and I think relevant or in relation to our previous episodes, we are seeing a world that is transforming very rapidly in this era. Turn of the century, there are constant vying for authority, European supremacy in terms of who's the continental powerhouse, whose empire is going to reign supreme. And you also have the underpinnings of all these nationalistic movements that we've talked about as well. And all of this is coming to a head. And it's, as we'll see, upend, the Russian oligarchy.
Yeah, it's interesting because we look at, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and him being seen as an oppressor, and you have this Serbian nationalist movement that's trying to take him down. But when we look to Russia, a lot of those same complaints, I guess you could say, and same sort of changes are all present, but it's mostly a domestic issue. Russia being a much larger place with a much more diverse population, but you're still seeing these general themes, and political assassinations, like we talked about the last few weeks, is kind of commonplace in the early 20th century and late 19th century. So, for a monarch to not be able to see some of the changes around them, it's foreshadowing a little bit that it's not going to end well. And I think when we look at Britain, we look at France, even Germany, right? There's parliaments, there's prime ministers. There's a lot of power given back to the people in some capacity. And it's not just autocratic rule. And the rest of Europe wants in on that game. They see the rights that they can have. And, as a peasant or as a farmer, right? And we talked about it a little bit last week on, being a tenant farmer, right? There's no future for a lot of these people. And they're starting to, be educated. They're starting to read. They're starting to learn from other places and what's going on. And it's only going to kind of put some gasoline on the fire that's starting to grow. So we'll see how that all comes together. But this is the theme of Europe at this point. This is these small powder kegs can go in one of two directions if they're not handled really, really quickly. And reform sometimes helps with those things. But sometimes, the horses have left the stable and they're not coming back, and it's just a matter of time.
I think it's very well said. And I think in the middle of all of this, you have, Tsar Nicholas II, who, he's relatively young, right? Like throughout all of this as it's happening, he does rule for some time, but he kind of grows up in a world that is kind of initiating or already seeing some of these elements of transformation or change that are going to occur at a very macro and micro level. But as we'll see, he is someone who kind of holds on to the traditions and the cultural and mores and values of the family and oligarch that he grew up in, and is very hesitant and resistant to the change because, I'm sure he aptly noticed that it was going to upend all of his power and take away from the control and autocratic nature of how Russia was run.
And I think it's this really weird kind of crossroads where a lot of these leaders get to, where you are part of this royal family, divine family in the case of the Romanovs specifically, and you need to keep this aura of strength and divinity, and you have expectations from your father and people around you, but then to kind of move in the other direction and be a little bit more maybe democratic and reformist, sometimes are seen as being weak and giving away some of your power. And we saw that with Kaiser Wilhelm when we talked about him, and coincidentally him and Tsar Nicholas had a friendship up to the war. He was expected to be this great general, hardened general, really strong person, but he really wasn't that type of person. He was a little bit more compassionate in some areas, and to move away from what you're expected to do, what you've been told as a kid your whole life, that you're going to be this strong divine leader, to kind of go back and say, yeah, I'm going to give some power back to the people. I'm going to take away some of that control. I think it's a really difficult position for a lot of leaders to get in. And I think I make the mistake sometimes of being like, well, he wasn't reforming enough. He wasn't looking at what was going on around him. But I think, you have to see what's going on around you, and you have to kind of come out of that shell sometimes. And we talked about that with other leaders, right? Where they're not able to see what's going on around them to be able to understand it and find what that balance is. And I think that's always a challenge. And I think Tsar Nicholas is no exception to that.
Well, I think it's such a good point because I think even today, in examples much less extreme than this, people are resistant to change, right? People will fight change tooth and nail to keep the status quo, even if it's not that great, because it's comfortable. And in his case, it's extremely comfortable. All right. We could probably get into his bio now, but I'll kick it off with a quote because I think it really does just kind of level set for our listeners. This is from Robert K. Massey, and he did a biography on Nicholas and Alexandra, his wife, who we'll get to. Born to a life of unimaginable privilege, Nicholas was a fragile, introspective child, often overshadowed by his more robust siblings, and the court recognized early that this boy would never match the vigor of his ancestors.
So, Richie, you have a brother. Would you say you're the more robust of the two brothers? How would you say you're described in that sense? Like, come on, bust as a brother? Like, I think of all the words you're going to use, I don't think that's one I would have maybe put to the top of the list. But anyways.
Great choice of adjective to do a comparison. But the other thing that stuck out to me, because that was the first one, because I immediately went where you went. But the last piece about never matching the vigor of his ancestors. And I think to me, that's a very powerful quote or segment of that quote, because one, it kind of goes back to the longevity of the Romanov dynasty and, the role that they've played in Russia for the last 3 centuries, and this cross, ancestorial comparison between how he fits or will measure up against everyone that's come before him. And we're talking about some very notable figures like, Catherine the Great, and where's Tsar Nicholas going to be when it's all said and done?
It's so true, because we have to remember, when we think of Russia, right, the Russian Empire is very, very powerful. It's a huge country. There's a ridiculous number of people just living within its borders. 300, 400, 500 years earlier, it really wasn't that powerful. It was just still trying to set its feet. It really wasn't a France or a Britain or a Spain where it was really entrenched and taking control of the world it was in. It was the Ottomans really controlled that side of the world, and the Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth and different things in Eastern Europe. But now, like, you've seen centuries of just expansion and strength, and now you are an elite superpower on the world stage. I think that's where that word vigor must come from, is how are you going to live up to these great men and women who have come before you, who have expanded Russia and made it such a powerful state? You know, what's next for you? What's your next territorial gain? Or what's the next thing you're going to do to push the country further on? But, you know, there's a part of that of making sure certain people aren't left behind. And, you know, if you look in one direction, you know, it's going to maybe lead to not the best outcomes, but ultimately like 300 years of just expansion and growth and continued territorial gains. That's a pretty tough thing to live up to if you're a czar or really anybody at that point.
Of course. I'm sure he feels this pressure from day one. And maybe we'll get into some of his early childhood now. But so he's born on May 18th, 1868. He's the eldest son of Emperor Alexander III and Empress Maria Ferdinova. She was actually the princess of Dagmar of Denmark. So his birth into the Romanov dynasty, obviously, as we said, this is one of the oldest, most powerful, and probably most wealthy families in Europe. Like the opulence that I read about and the lavishness of their palaces honestly sounds comparable to like something in Versailles based on what some historians are saying. And Nicholas spends a lot of his early years like confined to this kind of very opulent upbringing. He's traveling from imperial palace to imperial palace, from St. Petersburg to a palace in Crimea. This is a favorite retreat of the Romanov dynasty. These palaces have this very grand architecture, these beautiful extensive gardens. They're a very picturesque yet extremely isolated environment for the young Nicholas and his siblings. And this is a bit of a theme that I think you'll see in his life, right? Like he's very insulated and he's always at a distance from what's actually going on at the ground level.
It's a big country too, right? That's the thing we need to remember. Like it's not Paris and it's not too hard to get to the other side of the country or England where you're able to travel to Scotland and see what's going on, even to Ireland if you really needed to see what was going on. This is a massive country where, you know, it's taking days and days and days to traverse. So not only is it difficult to get around, but if you're trying to get a lay of the land of what's going on in Ukraine or what's going on in Siberia, you're getting that all third, fourth accounts, and you're trying to trust people around you. So it's going to be tricky. And on top of that, too, and we like to talk about railways in this podcast when we can, is Russia's railway is nowhere near where the rest of the world is. It's very, very, I would say primitive at this point. And, you know, getting around is really, really tricky. So yeah, you're right. Like if he's just moving palace to palace, he's really not getting to see what, you know, true Russian life is. And, you know, for a lot of people, there's a lot of struggles that are going on, and we'll start to get into that in a little bit. But yeah, you're right. He's living this. He's jumping from palace to palace to Versailles to mini Versailles, almost by the sounds of it. So yeah, it's quite a life.
Yeah, and I think you nailed it. And this is a theme that kind of cuts across this chapter of his life. You know, he's a young boy. His upbringing is really steeped in the traditions and values of the Russian aristocracy. His education is extremely well planned. Again, it kind of reflects the expectations placed on a future emperor. The curriculum includes things like a variety of languages: Russian, French, English, German, history, literature, military tactics. He's also taught about governance, the Russian Orthodox faith, and some of the very conservative principles that his father espouses. So his father, Emperor Alexander III, is this very imposing presence in his life, and he has a strong belief in autocratic rule, which is definitely handed down to Nicholas. And it really does play a significant role in shaping his worldview. And Alexander III is determined to preserve this kind of autocracy in Russia, especially after witnessing the assassination of his father, Emperor Alexander II, in 1881. And then there's Empress Maria Ferdinova. So this is what his biographers kind of refer to her as a very loving and attentive mother who kind of balances the strictness of Nicholas' father with a lot of warmth and affection. She's deeply involved with her children, ensuring that they're not only well-educated, but also instilled with a strong sense of duty and piety. Her influence is particularly evident in Nicholas's devotion to his family and the Russian church, traits that remain with him throughout his entire life. And I think, Paul, to a point that you made earlier, like there's this reality that he is constantly surrounded in luxurious environments, and the careful attention to his education is marked by this very interesting degree of isolation. All of his interactions are largely confined to his immediate family, tutors, and very select members of the court. So he has a very, very sheltered upbringing, while typical for like someone of his rank, which makes total sense, it almost sets him up to be, in my opinion, pretty unprepared for the complexities of actually ruling a very diverse and often turbulent empire.
I think there's no other way to really look at it at that point, especially when we know that his father didn't really take a keen interest in grooming him as a young man, a young boy, to eventually take over, with Alexander dying a bit younger than he expected, right? It was, I think he had plans that, when Nicholas is 30, we'll start to bring him into the realm and start to learn, which was far too late. And, if he's living this life up to his 20s and 30s where he's, only talking to close family and living in these palaces and not really getting down to brass tacks when he needs to, he's really going to struggle when it comes out of the gate. Something else that you mentioned too is the influence of the Orthodox Church in Russia and how he's learning about the church and all the things that come with it. We can't understate how powerful the Orthodox Church is in Russia at this point. We get to this trope all the time is religion is everything and the only thing for a lot of times, but it gets to a point in Russia where it's so powerful because they see the Tsar as being appointed by God. And so I mentioned earlier about this divine status. Not only are you sheltered, you are kind of told from a young age that you're going to be great and all these sort of things and living in this luxurious lifestyle. There's another element that your family has been appointed by God and you have a divine right to be where you are. And that's a really powerful sentiment for anybody because you can think, well, if God's looking out for me, I can do no wrong, right? There's nothing I really have to worry about. And, if someone doesn't have, the most understanding of what's going on, they can really let that affect them. And so a couple things about the church was it was the only way for a lot of the peasants who were illiterate to really learn about the world. And so there was a lot of teachings coming out of the church that always kind of favoring the Tsar and the Tsarist regime. There was a lot of education coming from there and really was kind of like a propaganda arm, for lack of a better term, for the Tsar and the Romanovs is, you are divinely appointed and any insult towards the Tsar and the Romanovs is basically like insulting God. And so now you've got this really powerful entity essentially being used as a way to control and influence the masses. But it also, I like to think, goes to the heads a little bit of the Romanovs, because if they genuinely believe this as well, that they've been appointed by God, they might have a little bit of a, hey, I can do no wrong, in this sort of this area. But things start to change as the peasants start to see the church as being corrupt and not being, practicing what they preach. And so it worked well to begin with because the church is saying, hey, the Tsar is great, the Romanovs are divinely appointed. But if people start to turn on the church, there's a connection there, right? If you turn on the church, you're going to turn on the Romanovs and the Tsar. So something to keep in mind as we go forward. But this is the power of the Orthodox Church at this time, and this is the world that he's stepping right into.
It's interesting, right? Like this whole idea of the divine right of kings and how important that is to this autocratic oligarchy type rule that is very prevalent throughout Europe and predates some of this. But it's an interesting, combination of bedfellows between the oligarchs and the church, right? Because if you turn on one, you're inevitably going to have to turn on the other.
Especially when there's money going back and forth between them. The government spending money to build churches and this kind of stuff and help fund a lot of the things that the church wants to do. So it's it kind of goes hand in hand and eventually kind of comes back to bite them. But you're right, the divine right of kings is a perfect way to put it. There's always that connection in some capacity, which has its advantages. But when one of those dominoes fall, the other one's going to kind of come right behind it. So yeah, that's kind of where it ends up.
So if we kind of shift into the next, decade of his life, 1880s, we're talking about him being, just a young boy still. He's probably entering teenagehood. Another quote, because he's essentially preparing to rule at this point, right? He's not an infant. He's not a toddler. I imagine in the 1880s he's becoming a young man, and his education is really focused on him owning that whole role of being the heir apparent to the Russian throne. So the expectations begin to grow pretty significantly at this point. He is increasingly getting, more involved in state affairs. However, his involvement is carefully managed and somewhat limited by his father, and he remains cautious about exposing his son to the full responsibilities of governance. But he still needs to receive more formal training in statecraft and military matters. His education, again, it's pretty rigorous even in his early years, but it requires this very specific instruction in law, administration, the intricacies of Russian governance. And even despite Alexander III being very protective of his own authority, he still keeps Nicholas at bay and at a distance from the inner workings of government, believing that the young heir should be shielded from the burdens and complexities of ruling until absolutely necessary. This decision, it seems well-intentioned, ultimately would leave Nicholas with a very limited understanding of the challenges he's going to face eventually as a Tsar.
It's really surprising to hear that because there's so much evidence in history of planning for succession and how it's done right. And usually it's done wrong when it's either you throw someone into the fire with no experience or you shelter them so much that they're used to this really lavish lifestyle where they're not able to kind of, they want to continue to live that. And you see like bankrupted countries and those sort of things. But, I guess in Alexander's mind, he thinks, yeah, he'll get there one day, or maybe that's how he was raised. And he said, hey, this worked for me. It'll work for him. But yeah, it just seems like a really massive oversight to even not slowly bring him in, like to almost leave him fully at bay. It seems like a pretty big misstep from his father's perspective.
Yeah, and maybe it's like his expectation as a father is to protect his son as much as possible, but ultimately he does himself a pretty major disservice because he's going to end up leaving, the empire in the hands of someone who is largely incapable to understand those intricacies because he wasn't brought in early enough.
Yeah, I'd like to give him the benefit of the doubt, and maybe you're right. It's just, this world of politics is too crazy for a boy at this point, or a really young man. I'm not going to bring him into the fold, but if he's going to rule Russia one day, you're going to have to do it sooner or later. So why not sooner? But you can only speculate as to why, but we know that the outcome was definitely not the right choice.
Yeah. And I think even to that point, right? So he's not able to get the intricate lessons and like the close exposure that he needs to rule. But this decade's also kind of informed by his involvement in military affairs because these become more pronounced. So he's still preparing for the throne. He serves in the Russian military, which is not only just this very crucial aspect of education, but also a tradition for the Russian princes. Nicholas takes on roles within the military with dedication, learning about strategy, leadership, the life of a soldier. These experiences are meant to kind of instill in him a sense of discipline and deep connection with the Russian armed forces. In addition to his duties, and this is actually quite interesting, he embarks on some very extensive travels across Europe during this period. They kind of serve multiple purposes. They provide him with exposure to different cultures and political systems. They help to establish diplomatic relationships with other European monarchies. He visits countries such as Germany, France, Austria-Hungary, the United Kingdom, where he observes the functioning of constitutional monarchies and absolute monarchies alike. These experiences, meant to broaden his understanding of the world beyond Russia and allow him to meet other royal families, many of whom are his relatives, to the interconnectedness of the European royalty. And we've said it time and time again, they're all related in one way, shape, or form if we're talking about oligarchs at the turn of the century in Europe.
Again, every time we bring it up, it's just funny to me how interrelated everybody is. And my cousin's the Kaiser, or whatever it might be. And it's quite funny in that sense. There was one thing I read, I think it was when I don't know if it was this trip specifically, but when he went to the United Kingdom, and we'll get into this in a little bit, Tsar Nicholas was very, very anti-Semitic. He was actually in a room with a bunch of Jewish people, and he wrote back basically saying, for lack of a better term, it was, why are there all these Jewish people here? This is very weird. Like, just almost like kind of taken aback by it. So I think it's interesting to say, yes, he's going out and he's seeing diverse perspectives and different things, but he may not take it the best way. He sees people who are different, and specifically Jewish people in his mind. He's not taking this in as a learning experience, in maybe the full capacity that he should. But yeah, just a little interesting thing that I read about his, some of his trips to different European countries.
I think you nailed it though, Paul. Just based on what I read, none of this really stuck with him in terms of like broadening his like understanding, perspective on how to govern. If anything, it seems to have the exact opposite impact, which was it was like a recommitment to his father's principles of, conservative, autocratic rule. And that is the way we're going to get through this. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Even though he did see it, he saw the volatility of the political landscape across Europe. He saw the complexities that these countries were dealing with. In his mind, the only way to really deal with them was to just go back to those traditional values and just strengthen them.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to look at it. If he's just doubling down, then, and maybe back to our previous point of, bringing him into his father's inner circle, right? If he's kind of already, and maybe his father's thinking the same way too, we're stuck in our ways. He knows what he needs to do. why do we really have to broaden his horizons or really bring him in until he absolutely needs to be? So yeah, I think it really does go to show and explain maybe some of his decisions as time goes on around reforms and things like that, around just, we're going to stick to the old ways, stick to the ways of my father, and that's just the way it's going to be.
And it's interesting too, right? Because I think you and I touched on the topic so far, these kind of themes, which is a little bit of neglect. He's not super close to the realities of what he's going to have to take over. But then he's sent on these, military kind of ventures. He's sent to travel across Europe. But again, how close is he to the reality of the issues he's going to be dealing with? And I have another quote from Dominic Lievin. He's a biographer. He wrote Nicholas II, Emperor of All the Russias, and he talks about his life in the 1880s. And he says that his education was a curious mix of rigorous discipline and emotional neglect. His tutors molded him into a prince who would one day rule the Russian Empire, yet they did little to prepare him for the complexities of the modern world.
Yeah, again, living in the past a little bit here. And it's the theme that comes across this turn of the century, right? Is, evolve or die, really, for a lot of these nations and for a lot of these monarchies. So I like that quote a lot, because I think it really does go to show that, yes, he's getting an education on all of these things, but maybe not necessarily in the ways that he needs to be. And that kind of foreshadows too, and we'll get into it once we talk about the Russian war with Japan, around how the modernization is coming, and it's coming fast, and you need to be able to adapt, not just, over decades, but year to year from a technological, social perspective. And if you're not on the top of your game, someone else is going to step in and take over. But yeah, if he's learning kind of the old ways of doing things, it's going to really cost him down the line.
And it seems like nobody's challenging him. Right? Yeah. It's like he's just steadfast in his beliefs, but his tutors are just kind of checking boxes, and no one's really willing to challenge him on his perspective of point of view. Like any good teacher, any good tutor, you're supposed to challenge the way your pupil is thinking or framing the situation around them. It seems like he didn't have that.
Yeah, it sounds like a bunch of groupthink. He got a bunch of tutors together. His father's telling him certain things, and they're just, yeah. That's true. And I feel like too, they're not going, if the tutors are coming in and being all reformist with him and the father found out, I'm sure that's, knowing Russia, they're probably not going to last very long. At the very least, they're going to find someone else who can teach him the right way. And, his father's eyes. Yeah.
And I think great segue. So we're finishing up his education, and he's in his adolescence, and we're going to shift to like the 1890s, the next decade. So he's officially a young adult at this point, but something quite unforeseen happens. In 1894, this is the turning point of Nicholas's life, and in the history of the Russian Empire, essentially, too. On October 20th, 1894, Emperor Alexander III dies unexpectedly at the age of 49, and this essentially leaves the empire in the hands of his 26-year-old son, Nicholas. There is a suddenness of his father's death that thrust Nicholas into the position of Tsar, and again, I think most historians would agree at this point that this role he was very deeply unprepared for, and the death not only came as a shock to Nicholas, but to the entire nation. So as the late emperor was known for his strength and vigor, his passing kind of left Nicholas grappling with this immense grief, the weight of the crown, and the daunting task of leading a vast and complex empire.
I think it's funny just because from what I know about his father, I read something about, his death being sudden. We talked that the nation was shocked. Everybody was shocked. But who wasn't shocked? His doctors. He was known for being a massive drunk. Not to say massive drunk, but like 19th century, early 1900s, late 1800s level of drunk. But the man loved his vodka, and his doctors basically said, you have to stop drinking vodka because your liver's going to fail. And eventually that's what killed him, was liver failure. There's stories that he had a special boot created where he could slide a flask of vodka or like a little bottle of vodka in his shoe so his doctors wouldn't see, or anybody around him wouldn't see. And then when he was in meetings or something, he would just pull it out, take a quick sip, throw it back down. So, yes.
Man.
Yeah. Shock to the world for sure because of his age and everything like that. But, wasn't, I think, the healthiest man in the world. And I think, the writing was a bit on the wall. And again, it's late 19th century. There's liver failure is going to do anybody in, and eventually that's what does him in. But I just thought that was a funny story around, you do read of everybody was so shocked and, oh my goodness, what was going to happen? And, his doctors knew very well that he was on a rough course for his future.
I love that the doctors are never surprised. They're just sitting there. We've been telling you for months.
Yeah, exactly. We've laid it out very clearly for you, and you've chosen not to act. And now everybody's surprised. And I'm sure the doctors are not sitting there with a smug face, but just being like, well, we told you so. And here we are. But you're right, though. Like, the suddenness, I think, regardless of the doctors and everybody knowing, is so important, because we've talked about it so many times already. He's not ready for this. He's not prepared. And now he has to jump into this world where World War I's about 15 to 20 years away. Multiple revolutions are on the horizon. War with Japan is coming. Russia needs massive modernization from a social and military and even industrial standpoint. And he has to be at the forefront of all this. And if he has no preparation or very little preparation on how to deal with all these competing interests to be able to accomplish some of those things, and on top of that, he wants to stick to the old ways. I don't even, was it doomed from the start? Again, I don't like to say that anything was inevitable, but I think in this case, like, I really don't see how he could have succeeded long term with, the kind of how everything was set up for him and where we see things going.
I have an answer for that, Paul, and this comes directly from the Tsar himself. So this is actually documented, and again, always take that with a grain of salt. But in his own words, he reportedly told a close confidant, "What is going to happen to me, to all of Russia? I am not prepared to be Tsar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling."
Well, there it is. Right from his mouth. I don't think you can get any more accurate than that. We're seeing it from, looking at this 100 plus years later, and from everything that people have written about him and what's going on around him. But ultimately, he knows it more than anybody else. So yeah, I think you're right. There's your answer. He knows it. Maybe not everybody knows it, but it's going to make things really, really challenging.
Yep. And soon after this, so soon after he ascends the throne, he actually gets married to Princess Alix of Hesse, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. So here we are again. Everyone's related.
Yeah, there it is.
It's in a marriage that was arranged actually with the approval of Nicholas's father before his death, and that takes place on November 26, 1894. Alix, who takes the name Alexandra Ferdinova upon converting to Russian Orthodoxy, becomes Empress of Russia. So historians think this couple actually shared quite a deep, genuine devotion and affection towards each other. But her transition into the Russian court life is fraught with difficulties. She's a very strong-willed personality. She's deeply religious. Her foreign background led to these kind of very strained relationships with the Russian nobility and public, who found her kind of aloof and unapproachable. But there is very little doubt that they didn't genuinely love each other.
Just I keep seeing these connections with Louis and Marie Antoinette, right? Not ready to take over, not effective as a leader, foreign wife who's not respected by the people and the court, and essentially kind of ineffective as well. I think, Marie Antoinette with the lavishness and, not being, the most influential when it came to ruling. And I think the same situation here is, you've really brought someone else in who's, maybe not living, as lavishly as Marie Antoinette, but is definitely someone who struggles with understanding what to do and how to govern as well, when she needs to. So yeah, it's they definitely loved each other and I think had a good marriage in that sense. But to get to the level where you need to rule as husband and wife, wasn't if you're going to pick two people, you're definitely not going to pick the Tsar and his wife.
And I think there's a perfect example I'm going to talk about next as to why they were way in over their heads. And this is around, I'm not going to pronounce this right, but I'm going to try. It's around their coronation and the Koidinka tragedy. So this happened in 1896. It's 2 years after ascending the throne. They're formally crowned in a grand and elaborate ceremony held at the Assumption Cathedral in the Kremlin in Moscow in May of that year. So it's a pretty significant event. It's intended again to solidify Nicholas's position as the legitimate ruler of Russia and to celebrate the continuity of the Romanov dynasty. The ceremony is attended by dignitaries from all around the world, and the streets of Moscow are filled with festivities reflecting the kind of, grandeur and power of the Russian Empire, just a time to celebrate and bask in your country's glory. However, the celebrations quickly turned tragic during a public festival held at the Koidinka field to mark the coronation. This is 4 days after it starts, which is on May 30th, 1896. An estimated 500,000 people gather at the field, eager to receive food, drinks, and souvenirs. This event is very poorly managed. There's not enough security, there's not enough provisions. As the crowd surges forward in a panic to secure the limited gifts, a catastrophic stampede ensues, resulting in the deaths of over 1,000 people and injuries to many more. So this disaster becomes known as the Koidinka tragedy, and it casts a very dark shadow of his coronation and undermines the festive spirit of the event. But this is kind of the first part of his legacy, and it immediately goes wrong.
Especially if you are supposed to be divinely appointed by God, the type of omen that's putting on
exactly
for the rest of the people, right? I think you said it really well there. But, I think, again, 500,000 people showing up for some free food and free souvenirs and that kind of stuff, I think also goes to show the state of the empire on, there's a lot of people coming for, some basic luxuries of life. And I'm sure there's some fanfare around it as well that they're interested to see. But it goes to show where the common person is at this stage. They're not, I got better things to do. I've got enough food. I've got enough private possessions that I think I'm good. 500,000 people is a lot by any standards, especially back then. And, just even thinking about, the method of how people were killed in this sense is just, it's so heartbreaking. And it's unfortunately the start of many, many deaths to come for the Russian people. A lot of hardship. Yeah. But yeah, not a good start for the Tsar and his reign.
And the 90s, the 1890s are a bit of a turbulent period for him. So you have this kind of tragedy, this event that casts a very dark shadow over the beginning of his reign. But you also have the birth of his first daughter. And the reason I'm saying daughter, I'm sure they were very elated to have a healthy daughter, but the goal was a son, and because you need an heir. And even though it's 1898, those are the aristocratic values that they're still trying to uphold. And this leads to disappointment with the broader royal circle and amongst the Russian nobility, and because they're very eager for a male successor to secure the Romanov line moving forward. But in parallel, as Nicholas is settling into his role as Tsar, his reign begins to face increasing challenges. The late 1890s sees the rise of various political movements that seek reform and challenge the autocratic system. You have growing social unrest. It's fueled by rapid industrialization, poor working conditions, and widespread poverty. Again, the Russian Empire is vast, it's diverse, its struggle to modernize while maintaining these very rigid structures of autocracy are very, very difficult to do. And Nicholas himself is committed to upholding the autocratic principles that he inherited from his father. So he resists calls for reform, and he believes that any concessions could weaken the monarchy's power.
Yeah, and I think it's a good foreshadow of things to come. I have a historian here who kind of talks about some of the problems that Russia's facing, and I think it kind of does a pretty good job of overviewing really why people are just so angry and upset, and how they've can look at the Romanovs and look at the church and see the power that they have, and then look at kind of their own lives and see where they're at, and then look around the world and see what things are going on. But basically, they break it down into 4 different elements. So first, these newly emancipated peasants earn too little and were not allowed to sell or mortgage their allotted land. Second, ethnic minorities resented the government because of its quote-unquote Russification, discrimination, and repression, both socially and formally, such as banning them from voting or serving in the army or the navy, and limiting their attendance in schools. So again, to remind everybody, this is a big empire with Muslims, non-Russian Orthodox people, and then just non-Russian speaking people. You have look at the Soviet Union and a lot of those states. You see, Central Asia, a lot of people in those places trying to find where they fit into this world. Going back to the reasons, though, the third reason was the industrial working class resented the government for doing too little to protect them by banning strikes and labor unions. So this is happening across the world, where workers are trying to get rights because, they're working in terrible conditions. If they don't show up one day because they're sick or whatever that might be, they could get fired. Injuries on the job, there's no protections against that. So it's really, really tough living for a lot of these people, and they feel that they have no way to band together and to fight back against, what they see as oppression from a working perspective. But the fourth thing I think is maybe one of the biggest things is the educated class is starting to spread radical ideas after the relaxing discipline in universities and allowing new ideas and new things to come through. And so I think that's kind of that last point is, you can see very much a divide between poor peasant working class of them trying to figure out where they fit in this world, and they're angry. But now you can start to see this middle class and even upper class being kind of thrown into these radical ideas of seeing the monarchy and these ultra wealthy, ultra powerful small group of people and how they fit into all of this. And so now you're starting to see some of that descent move up the social ladder. And that's how things are going to start to boil over in Russia, is you now have it kind of happening across the board. You have now you're going to have the manpower behind it, but you're also going to have some political power and some wealth and all of the little things that you need to really successfully push back against, a massive empire and, ruling class like the Romanovs.
Yeah, it seems like the 1890s, 1900s for not just Russia, but a lot of these old European oligarchs who are trying to hold on to their power. They're dealing with a lot of the same issues, right? Like I think whenever we go through those kind of themes, they undercut a lot of what's going on in Europe at the micro level. So you're talking about these very deep-seated social, economic, infrastructural kind of driven changes that are happening. But then you also have, nothing happens in isolation in this world or at this time. So not only is he contending with these kind of micro level changes on the ground, there's still a world outside of Russia that is constantly still vying for supremacy. This is the early 1900s. This is about which nation's going to reign supreme, who's going to have the biggest empire, who's going to have the most authority. And I think this is probably a good point to talk about one of the biggest challenges that they faced in the early 1900s, specifically in 1904, which is the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War.
Yeah, I think that's a great transition point because you're right. We talked about last week how the Austrians had, taken over Bosnia, and the Russians kind of conceded and said, all right, fine, we're not going to get involved. And eventually that's, we can't do that again. And then they step in for World War I. But we have to look at Russia, right? We're talking about the European theater, but all the way in Siberia and into Asia, you have to start seeing, or have to remember now, is Japan is transitioning out of, more of maybe what we would see as a traditional Japan into the Japan we see of World War II, expansionist, militaristic, really starting to modernize and push their borders a little bit farther. So this kind of starts to happen with a battle between the areas of Manchuria, which is like northeast China, and Korea. The Japanese want to have some influence in that space, and the Russians want to have some influence in that space. One of the key pieces to this is the Russians want a Pacific port that's available 12 months of the year. Right now, all of their ports are a little bit too far north. It's very cold in Siberia, ice forms, and they're not able to, move their fleet in and out as they would like. And so they're starting to push a little bit south. The Japanese are starting to push a little bit north. And eventually war kicks off, and it is an absolute disaster for the Russians. And there's a few reasons for it, but really it's naval supremacy is what the Japanese have. And it's not that they have this massive fleet and the Russians have this little small fleet. They're pretty even when it comes to numbers, but there's a couple pieces to this. One is Japan is much closer to home. They can supply their ships a little bit easier. They're not as stretched as far as the Russians are. Communications and supply lines are tighter, but the Japanese have much more advanced technology. One of the things that they were able to do is they had a new type of technology that allowed them to, it's kind of like a rangefinder. So they were able to see the distance of ships from a much farther distance so they could prepare their shots a lot sooner. And I think in one battle, the Battle of Tsushima, the Russian Navy is completely destroyed. And it happens very, very quickly. And at this point, there was really no going forward for the Russians at this point. They were defeated quite substantially. They end up signing a treaty with the Japanese and having to give over a lot of territory and influence over Korea, and Manchuria goes towards Japan. And this is just huge back in Russia because there's a couple things that's happening here. During this war, you're really starting to hear more stories about how poorly Russian soldiers are being treated by their officer class, being forced to eat just terrible food, stay in terrible conditions where their officers are living a bit more lavishly. And so it's this microcosm of how Russia is really having this elite class and this really poor class who's trying to gain some rights. It's kind of extending to the military as well. And now we're starting to add in some more of those middle class people starting to think a little bit differently. It's all kind of starting to blend together into something, but nothing's worse than sending off a bunch of young men to go fight and then them just getting obliterated in a war. So you've lost a lot of people. And now you've seen great shame come to Russia as, we're this invincible power. And again, there's a lot of racism that comes into this. Sure, we could lose a war to our fellow Europeans, but to lose to an Asian country who for centuries has had European influence and European dominance in that region. Now Japan is actually stepping up and able to fight back against us, the Europeans. That just doesn't happen. And what a national shame and an international shame this is for Russia. So it really doesn't look good on the country. And it really doesn't look good on Tsar Nicholas.
I think it's such a powerful symbol of what's going on, though, right? This loss to this much smaller nation, this non-European power that is trying to vie for their spot in the world at this time. And it kind of shows him as this very out-of-step ruler who's just not with the times. He handles this in a very disastrous fashion. And it kind of just showcases his glaring deficiencies as as a leader in an era where I think leaders are starting to be expected to be more adaptable and strong to the changing conditions of, military tactics, just for one example.
Absolutely. And to understand the limitations, to understand, have good intelligence, and not just throw yourself into a conflict because maybe it makes you look good, or maybe you're starting to try to be more of like your ancestors who had done, so much great work to expand the Russian Empire. But eventually you're going to run into another empire that's looking to do the same thing. And in this case, for the Russians, they lose this, but it kicks off into the 1905 Russian Revolution, like almost immediately, and kind of some little bit of crossover where you're starting to see these strikes are happening, protests in the streets, and it's not something that is going to go away as much as maybe Tsar Nicholas would want it to.
Yeah, I think with the revolution of 1905, you have this kind of discontent that's been simmering in Russia for years finally boils over, right? Igniting this revolution. It's triggered by a series of events. Obviously, the disastrous outcome of the Russo-Japanese War. You have the brutal repression of a peaceful protest that happens on January 22nd, 1905. It's known as the Bloody Sunday. On this day, thousands of workers led by Father Gregory Gapone marched onto the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to present a petition to Nicholas II, demanding better working conditions, political reforms, and the end to the war. The Imperial Guards opened fire on the unarmed crowd, and they killed and wounded hundreds. So Bloody Sunday kind of shocks the nation. And again, just severely damages Nicholas' image as the little father of the Russian people.
Yeah, the themes continue, right, of a military and police force that's not able to control crowds at all. And for something that should have been peaceful and was peaceful up to a point, unnecessarily turning violent and resulting in, the deaths of many innocent civilians. And again, if there's ever a reason to continue on with pushing for a cause, to see your fellow citizens, your neighbors, your family get killed because they're just trying to push change, it's really going to change things. But there's also a piece to this too, where there's this element within Russia of violence amongst the masses. Like they're almost looking for blood in some capacity. And one thing that I read about that was kind of a little messed up was these anti-Jewish pogroms, which kind of happened around this time, especially during the revolution, where these anti-Jewish riots would break out. So a lot of anger from this revolution. And guess what? There's an ethnic minority who is someone we can pick on, has all of this nasty stuff said about them all the time and has been for so long. And our czar is very openly anti-Semitic. So what do we got to lose? So just touching on it briefly, because it was something I didn't realize, how terrible it was. But there's actually it was an article in the New York Times in 1903 talking about one of the anti-Jewish riots. Basically said they're worse than the censor will permit me to publish, basically saying there was a well laid out plan for the general massacres of Jews following the Orthodox Easter. The mob was led by priests, and the general cry was, quote, "Kill the Jews," was taken up all over the city. The Jews were taken wholly unaware of this and slaughtered like sheep. Somewhere between 50 to 100 were killed, much more were injured, and it didn't stop for men, women, children, this kind of stuff. So there is this sentiment across the whole country that anger and violence is going to kick off at any moment. And to see something like this, where, this is again, the tropes of, they're working behind the scenes, that sort of thing. When you see some of these anti-Semitic tropes that come up, to see that there's this system that's just working against you as a person from the Tsar, coming from some awful things you'd say about the Jewish people at this time. It's all kind of culminating amongst the people, and some really disgusting, nasty violence is kicking off really easily in parts all over the country.
Yeah, it seems like it's just a powder keg, right? Like it is just busting at the seams. Nothing is really there's no way to rein this in at this point with the revolution until he does make some concessions in October, which I think is somewhat progressive, but I don't think he had any options.
And I don't think he had any intent of really, I think he passed them and then kind of said, yeah, I can slowly chip this back to where I need to be, and this will settle things down.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think even with those concessions, right? So it's referred to as the October Manifesto, and he essentially grants some limited civil liberties. You can speak freely. You can have the freedom of assembly, association. And he actually promises the establishment of a state Duma, which is a Russian parliament with legislative powers.
Which is kind of a big deal on paper, right? If I'm
Huge.
a Russian person at this time being like, oh my God, we have a parliament? This is insane. This is crazy. This is exactly what we were looking for. But like we said before, right? He's not the one he's reluctantly doing this, saying, fine, we can put it together, but they're not going to have any power. I'm still going to be ultimately in control. I'm the autocrat. I'm going to make this work. And for a time it does, keeps things a little bit more stable. But, there's a man in Switzerland named Lenin. There's these Bolsheviks that are starting to grow, and we're not going to get into that today because that's a whole other story. But the seeds are starting to be set of, maybe he pushed the pendulum back a little bit, but war and the true root causes of everything really haven't been addressed. And he's really just buying himself time, I think, with this manifesto.
And I think even as not necessarily a side note, but obviously we've been talking about like the micro and macro view about what's going on at the ground level, what's going on across the world right now or in proximity to Russia, but like what's going on at home for him. And I think amongst the revolution, the Romanov family continues to grow, but not in the way that he would have wanted or expected. So in 1904, their long-awaited son and heir, Alexei, is born. Brings immense joy to the court, to the family. However, it's kind of overshadowed by this devastating diagnosis. He suffers from hemophilia, which is a blood disorder that prevents his blood from clotting properly. It's often referred to as the royal disease, a condition that had already affected several European royal families, including Alexandra's own family. And then they also welcomed 3 more daughters. So again, you can kind of see the internal pressure of wanting to have an heir. And he has 3 more daughters, and his son now has the royal disease that's going to make his life a lot more difficult. And again, will undermine this idea of how strong of an heir can you even make if he's got the royal disease.
Yeah, and I believe they keep it secret as well. They don't really share that he's sick too. So not only is you're worried about your son's life every day, if he falls and cuts himself or if he gets into a bit of a nasty injury, right, that could be the end for him. And I know this takes a big toll on his mother, but also, worrying about somebody finding out what's going on. And like you said, the weakness of this royal dynasty. Can you really rule Russia if your only heir is a sick young boy who we don't know how long he's going to live for? And so, yeah, I think you make a good point of, things are exploding outside, but he's also deeply terrified of, his family life and what's going to come next for him and, his really ill son.
And this kind of takes us up to like the 1910s-ish. So obviously there's a lot of turmoil going on at the ground level. And, I know we've probably have repeated ourselves multiple times across the last few episodes about the outbreak of World War I. So we're not going to go into that with a lot of detail. But, the World War breaks off, and this is just another critical juncture in his reign. Tensions between the great powers of Europe escalate following the assassination of the Archduke. Nicholas faces a monumentous decision, whether or not to involve Russia in the conflict. Influenced by a combination of factors, including alliances with France and Britain, national pride, and the need to assert Russia's status as a major power, he decides to join the war on the side of the Allies. Yeah,
and I think it comes back to what we talked about last time with Russia had given so many concessions to Austria before. And again, you can't seem weak, because if you do, this is all about prestige and all about influence and all about power. And if you let Austria bully you, what's to say they're not going to continue to do it until you step in? Exactly. And so, he definitely sees this as an opportunity to step in. And also too, like, Russia has a lot of people. They're going to have a very strong army, but does it have the best political appetite at this time? I'm sure initially there's always some excitement over new conflict and things like that. But again, there's no stability within Russia at this point that any ruler should feel confident about. So not saying he made the wrong decision by stepping into World War I, but I think he was definitely doing it on some shaky ground.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. To your point, Russia is massive. The amount of manpower they have that they could throw at these, military tactics outnumbers most of the European powers. However, the reality of the situation is that they are plagued by inadequate supplies, poor infrastructure, and very outdated tactics. So this turns very disastrous and draws out the campaign for Russia. They lose massive casualties, and, on their home fronts essentially crumbling, and it's already exacerbated by the very dire social and economic conditions that they're already contending with. And In 1915, as the war drags on and the Russian army suffers even more severe defeats, Nicholas makes the fateful decision to take personal command of the military. This move, which is intended to boost morale and demonstrate his commitment to victory, might just be the biggest mistake he makes. By assuming direct control of the army, he leaves the day-to-day governance of the empire in the hands of his empress, a decision that further alienates him from the Russian people. She's already unpopular. She doesn't have the Russian heritage. She's seen as aloof. She becomes increasingly reliant on a very interesting figure named Rasputin, who we will return to. He's a mystic healer who's gained significant influence in the royal court. And this, coupled with, Alexandra's autocratic style of governance, just adds fuel to the fire of the level of public dissatisfaction and kind of just erodes the already fragile trust that exists in the monarchy. So the war, which was initially intended to, create this fervor of patriotism, becomes the single biggest source of widespread discontent for the Russian population.
What a disaster. You're picking two people who really just don't have any skills to do what they're needing to do. Tsar Nicholas is not a seasoned military commander, does not necessarily know what he's doing. And then, Alexandra trying to run the empire with Rasputin whispering in her ear on what to do. And we'll get into what his, we'll call them qualifications are, as we get to the future. But now you're going to have a czar who is trying to command these generals who are probably looking at him going, seriously? You really don't know what you're doing. And then you have these ministers who are taking orders from Alexandra, basically saying the same thing as, A, you don't know what you're talking about, and B, we're really listening to Rasputin, who's kind of working through you. And are you really even calling the shots here? And like you said, the Russian people are not going to have any trust over this. But now the aristocracy is not going to have any trust over this. There's really not many people left in their corner outside of the people who are maybe those more staunch conservative and traditionalists. But it's really getting tricky to the point where, people are going to start to look at this and say, a change needs to be made, whether it's, a bloody change or just a, hey, you need to step aside and we're gonna take over from here.
The writing's on the wall, Paul. I think you made a good transition there. And I think the situation in Russia essentially reaches a breaking point early 1917. And this is the February Revolution, sparked by widespread strikes, protests over food shortages in Petrograd. This is St. Petersburg. And it escalates into a full-scale uprising against the autocracy. The unrest spreads rapidly. Soldiers begin to mutiny, join the protesters, and the Tsar's grip on power weakens almost to nothing.
Yeah, it happens very, very quickly. That was one thing I was surprised about when I was reading it, was just, it's sprung up, and then very, very quickly, Tsar Nicholas is being told that he needs to abdicate. I think he was trying to get to St. Petersburg and he didn't even make it there. He's in a rail car and his generals are basically saying like, look, you don't have our support anymore. You don't have the army support. You got to step aside. And, this is separate from the Bolsheviks taking power and Lenin and the communists and that sort of thing. But just even people within, the traditional aristocracy are saying, hey man, it's time. You need to step aside. You need to abdicate and you need to give, power to the next piece that's coming within Russia. But it's just so fast. But again, the writing was on the wall. And when you have millions of people dying in a war that seems like you're going to lose or seems like it's going nowhere and is only going to provide more hardship to your kingdom and to your empire. Again, don't like using inevitable, but it becomes more and more inevitable as he starts making some of these decisions. And, we can see pretty clearly how he got to this point. And again, dealt a really tough hand, but, didn't really do much along the way to move it in the right direction.
Yeah, it's a quick revolution. Starts in February, and by early March, he's abdicated, and that essentially ends over 300 years of Romanov rule in Russia.
It's just that quick, right? It can take so long to build up, but it's so quick to tear it all down.
Yep. I think following his abdication, him and his family are placed under house arrest by the provisional government. The fall of the Romanov dynasty is kind of greeted with this very strange mixture amongst the populace of relief, but also uncertainty by the Russian people. They're eager for peace and reform, but they're uncertain about the future. Who's going to come in? Who's going to help us? Is someone actually going to help us? So the provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, attempts to stabilize the country and continue the war effort, but it struggles to maintain control in the face of rising radicalism and growing influence from the Bolsheviks, who are led by Vladimir Lenin, who we'll talk about in a later episode.
Yeah, it does open up a bit of a powder keg, and especially with, not a powder keg, more of a power vacuum, really, is the Tsar is out and there's not this person you can point to keep everything under control. And again, the war's not going well. The wars haven't gone well for Russia in decades. There's a lot of, push for change. And now things are starting to get violent, right? Before it was peaceful protests. Ooh, some people got shot. Not good, but we're still okay. We're not blowing up into anything. But now it's widespread violence that's really starting to come in. And Lenin and the Bolsheviks, these are not reformers who are coming in and trying to do this through the political system. They're going to be doing this very aggressively and very violently. And it's going to throw Russia into a full civil war for many, many years. But this is the radicalism of their ideas is, really that's radical change, not just in ideas, but also in methodology, because like I said, a lot of violence is coming really, really soon.
Yeah, and I think the violence, at least for the Romanov family, continues pretty immediately. So after, we're going to bypass a little bit, but once the Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution of 1917, the fate of Nicholas's family becomes increasingly precarious. The Bolsheviks kind of view the Romanovs as a symbol, and, I get it, of the old regime, and decide that the former Tsar and his family cannot be allowed to remain alive, fearing that they could become a rallying point for anti-Bolshevik forces. So in April 1918, the Romanov family is moved to a city in the Ural Mountains, where they are placed under strict confinement in the Hypateev house, which is ominously referred to as the Bolsheviks as the House of Special Purpose. As the Russian Civil War intensifies and the anti-Bolshevik forces, the White Army, approach, the local Bolshevik leaders decide to carry out the execution of the Romanovs to prevent any possibility of their rescue. And on the night of July 16th through the 17th, Nicholas, Alexander, and their 5 children and 4 loyal retainers are brutally executed by a Bolshevik firing squad in the basement of the house. The executions are carried out with kind of like ruthless barbarism, and the bodies are hastily buried in a secret location, and they're discovered and they're exhumed in the 20th century. But that execution, it marks the tragic end of a 300-year-old dynasty and kind of cements Nicholas in my mind as this very tragic historical figure.
Yeah, we won't get into it for the reasons of it's really, really nasty and pretty disgusting stuff that happens to the family and to the bodies and things after. But I did read that it took over 20 minutes to kill everybody in that room, with guns and bayonets. And they needed to do what they needed to do, whatever. That's the choice of the Bolsheviks. But the fact that it was just so hastily put together, so poorly executed, I think is kind of a microcosm of things that are to come for Russia. But you're right. It's such a sad ending, especially with, his young daughters being killed as well, his wife, this whole family, right? It's not just, your father needs to go and we'll put you in some house somewhere and you can live out your life. And that's it. It's this, like I said, this extra level of violence that's happening in Russia. And it's not even, if you look at like the French Revolution on, Louis and Marie Antoinette being killed on the guillotine, which again is still very violent and very much a public spectacle. They weren't, hastily shot and killed in a basement somewhere. It was, there's still a little bit of, I hate to say respect, but also just some efficiency to it. And okay, we're going to get this done and we're going to move on, right? Versus just
an element of dignity almost, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's an awful end to their lives, and for all of their poor choices and poor levels of governance to go out the way they came, and especially with their kids seeing their father get killed and all that in front of them, it's heartbreaking to even think about. And again, marks a really dark time for Russian history, and for a lot more darker times to come as Lenin and Stalin and the communist regime really starts to kick into high gear.
Yeah, it's a curious decision by the Bolsheviks. I kind of get the sentiment of the Romanovs being a rallying point, but I don't know how much merit that could have, and maybe that's something that we can look into in the preceding episodes about the actual threat that the Romanovs presented at this point.
Yeah, I agree. It would be really interesting to see, because at some point they could be seen as martyrs and still become that rallying point, if information got out about how they were killed and things like that. But yeah, that'll be an interesting one for another episode. But like you said, yeah, we are just scratching the surface on the Russian history, and especially this time frame where we have some really notable characters that we're going to get into over the next couple episodes. So stay tuned for that. And we will continue this story and kind of add some context around the Bolshevik uprising, who Rasputin is. And it's going to be a fun couple episodes as we see how all these characters kind of mold their way into this greater story of, the fall of the Romanovs and the rise of the Bolsheviks and communist Russia turning into the Soviet Union.
Great summary. A lot to look forward to.
Awesome. Definitely. All right. Thanks, everyone. And yeah, we'll be back next time with some more Russian history.
Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.